Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 133 of Scotonomics. We've got a live show for you this evening, so welcome to everyone who's joining us on YouTube, Facebook, and also on X. It's lovely for us that you could join us. Well, the first thing I'd like to do is introduce my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yes, absolutely fantastic. Had a holiday, so yeah, ready to go.
Ready to go. Looking forward to tonight's show.
Yes, should be interesting.
Fantastic. And here is tonight's guest. Hello, Mark Hooper. How are you doing?
Hi, William. Hi, Kieran. How are you?
We're good. I thought it'd be a good idea if you explain to people who you are and what you do first, Mark.
Okay. Well, I'm a Plaid Cymru councillor in the Vale of Glamorgan in South Wales. So Barry is people would have come across Barry probably with Gavin and Stacey, a lot of people nowadays. And it's actually, most of that was filmed in my ward, which is great. But it was also the place William was down in the summer for the Independence March we had through my hometown, which was fantastic.
That was the first time you had an Independence March there, wasn't it?
It is, yeah. So I think it was about the 8th that we'd had in Wales, but it was one, and there was about 8,000 people through the town, which is fantastic. We're in the centre of what's sometimes described as Britain at Wales in this southern bit. Okay. So it was a real eye opener, and the amount of people, even friends of my parents, who said, I popped down to have a look to see what it was like. That makes a big difference.
So tell me a little bit more politically what's happening with Plaid in Wales, and so for example, in your council, how many councillors do you have?
So we've got 5 Plaid councillors at the moment. We
a total
of 47.
Okay.
That's good. So we're the 3rd biggest group on the council. So it's a Labour-controlled council with some independents who work with them. And then you've got a group of Conservatives who are becoming increasingly reactionary in their politics, really focusing on the same things as Reform do. And then there's us lot who seem to be, one thing that I think our group does really well is make sure we actually hold the Labour government to account. We're probably the Labour group to account. We're probably the only ones who get into the nitty gritty. I think you sometimes wonder why people get fed up with politics. And when you get into the chamber and you see how many people just disregard the local process, it's not surprising. But I've enjoyed it. It's been really good. And we've had our first Reform councillor in the Vale as well. We had a by-election at the back end of the summer, which was close. We came from 4th to 2nd, but we missed out by, about 72 votes, something like that. So it's all, Wales is changing. You look at what happened in Caerphilly, which maybe we'll come on to in a second.
Yeah, I was interested, before we come into Caerphilly, what the makeup then of other councils in Wales looks like. How are Plaid doing in other places in Wales?
So Plaid historically has been a party that's done extremely well in the north and the west of the country. So where the language has stayed solid, essentially. But what you're starting to see now is other places, and we've been an outlier in the Vale of having representation. But at the moment, so if you go down to the level beneath the local authority, to the town council level, there's, I think it's 24 town councillors, 11 of them are Plaid Cymru. So you've got a situation where we're really close to having control of Barry Town Council, which is, so these things, when you start to build them up, they become really important. And Barry's a strange place. Barry's the birthplace of Gwynfor Evans, who was, renowned in Plaid terms as being the first MP when he won a by-election in Carmarthen, and his grandson is chair of our local party. So those roots are actually quite deep here as well.
So that's really interesting. And we definitely want to talk about Caerphilly, because it was a huge result. I think people in the independence movement in Scotland were incredibly heartened by it. Can you maybe tell our audience a little bit about the journey to that win?
Yeah, so Caerphilly's one of those places in the south that's had Plaid representation for a while. So the candidate Lindsay Whittle has been a councillor there for 50 years, for an example. So he's been around the block, and I think you probably wouldn't mind me saying that, and has stood on, I can't remember the number of occasions that he's actually stood and failed to win, both at Westminster and Senedd, first past the post. So he's been around and about. But I think but it's been a Labour seat since 1918. In whichever form of government, Labour have run and been the champions at Caerphilly for a long time. It's not something that anyone wanted. So the sudden death of the sitting member surprised everyone. But when it came to it, Reform thought they were going to win. So be in no doubt, Reform put everything into this election to win it. Farage was there 3 or 4 times, and you don't come there. And he was there on election day, but ran away as soon as he realised that he wasn't going to win it. But this was something that I was there on election day as well. And my reflection was, and people asked me, what do you think? And I thought it was going to be really close. And at the end of the day, it wasn't close. And I wasn't at the count, but I was listening to it as I was not sleeping. And at 2:15 in the morning, I awoke my wife. She's still not forgiven me, just to say Plaid had won. And the thing that I think stood out for me most, I had a text from somebody in the Labour Party the next day, and they said, for the first time in a long time, I've got hope. And that's somebody from the party who've just been, we've gone down to 11%. So I think there's a feeling that Reform needed to be beaten. There's a lot been said about, is the people just switching over just to be able to, the tactical vote. I'm unconvinced by that. The amount of people who I spoke to said, I voted Labour in the general election. I am never voting Labour again. I've never seen politics change at this speed before. And it's consistent now that the Labour Party, there's a journalist in Wales, Will Hayward, and he's saying Labour they're not fighting anymore to be the leaders of the Senedd. They're fighting for relevance. They're fighting to make sure they've got a rump of people to be in there and just hang in there. It's following almost the Scottish example, isn't it? What the speed of the change has been incredible.
Yeah, your Labour, interesting to know what your percentage of Labour people in Wales support independence. Our academic here, Sir John Curtis, estimates from his research that Labour in Scotland, it's about 39% of Labour members or voters, I think members who support independence. So I'd imagine you've got a good chunk of Labour people who are actually pro-independence as well.
Yeah. So there was some work done at the last Senedd election, and I think the conclusion they came to, 51% of people who voted Labour in the last Senedd election supported independence. Some of them may have been what we may term indie curious, but there's a huge rump of them, and I think the analysis has shown that actually their second favourite party has always been Plaid. So when it comes to a choice, when they see what's happened in Westminster and are really disappointed, it's not a difficult decision for them to come to Plaid. Similarly, it's not a difficult decision for a lot of Conservatives to go to Reform either, because Wales is a lot more British in lots of ways than Scotland is, because the border, most people are very close to the border, work, have friends and family across the border. So there's a lot of people jumping across the two. And I think you've got a situation now where it's really becoming a two-party race in a multi-party proportional system, which is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think William's keen to ask you some about the economics questions now.
No, you did really well. I was going to say first 10 minutes and it's 9 minutes 40. So you have done perfectly. Please, if you've got any political questions for Mark, do drop them in. But what I wanted to start with, Mark, was I wanted to start with, for our audience, you know, who will be in Wales and also in Scotland, is kind to look at some of the, I'm keen to look at some of the similarities that we see between Scotland and Wales, the Scottish and the Welsh economy. And the first one I kind of wanted to pick up on was this idea in both those nations, this idea of colonial conquest and resource extraction. So both nations have got this kind of shared history of conquest, colonial conquest, and resource extraction. Would you agree? Do you see those similarities and those connections?
I do. I may not use the same terminology because sometimes I think we're in a situation now, particularly for the independence movement, but also for Plaid Cymru. I think we're in a position where we're attracting new people to our party to vote for us, and I think sometimes the language that we use is, well, not sometimes, always the language we use is really important. I think there's some clarity that people understand that forever that Wales has been somewhere that has been where profits have been extracted from, and those profit extractions have gone via England, but they've gone to wealth. You know, sometimes we focus on it being, you know, it all goes to London. That's less of the case now. I think this goes to wealth, and that wealth is mobile and could be here, there, or anywhere. And I think that's becoming increasingly well understood, that people have seen that. Particularly, you know, our coal industry was a huge part of the Welsh society, not just economy. This was Welsh society, and people know that the benefits of it all left, and we're now left with a lot of the costs of it, including, you know, we've got coal tips that are still dangerous. You know, we sell it. So we remembered the Aberfan disaster from 1966 very recently. You know, this is something where the state, the UK state, you know, just left those communities with these dangerous tips, and they're still there. You know, you've got weather. We've had flooding again recently, and every time it floods in some of these communities, they look at the black hill that's behind their houses and worry about it. Now, yeah. I'm not suggesting that they're in immediate direct, you know, likelihood of collapsing again, but these things, you know, these things are not, they're man-made issues waiting to happen. So, you know, people get it that it's extractive, and I think that's largely behind. You look at some of the new industries, new energy industries, renewables. People are starting to go, you know, it's our wind, it's a bit colloquial, you know, it's our water. These challenges are starting to come forward now.
I remember when I went to university in Dundee, we rented our apartment in our third year, and the woman who owned the apartment was very staunch SNP, you know, so this was mid-1990s when there weren't many people who were staunch in SNP, and she had a sign on her window that said, "It's our water." And this was, you know, a real strong connection to the resource, which I think has been lost over the period of devolution, but is certainly coming back in Scotland over the last 10, 15 years. And I know, Kieran, you often speak about this kind of, it's so obvious now, platforms from oil and gas were out at sea, but electricity pylons show that the natural resources are being extracted. So I think there's a lot of similarities there. The next thing I wanted to focus on, and maybe it's a little bit away from the economics, was that I think that both the independence movements are underpinned by kind of progressive ideals. And I think you and I have such long conversations because we're so close in terms of the type of economy and society that we want to see. Again, do you feel those connections? And would you give us briefly a summary of the Welsh economy, because I know you often go off to the society, but I'm going to pull you back on the economy. What do you think an independent Welsh economy looks like? Is it built on these progressive ideas which underpin the independence movement in Scotland?
So I appreciate this is your channel, and you can ask the questions. I can answer them in the way that I think you have to start with society. I think we have to start with the society that we should be expecting for our people, and the economy needs to fit that. So I think the economy, yes, will be underpinned by progressive ideas, but the starting point are simple things. The starting point are things, and these are economic issues as well. It's things like housing, it's things like food, It's things like, you know, access to the funds to be able to live, adjust and progress and, you know, thrive in life. And there's too many of people in Wales who are not doing that. Now, these are things that, again, we've talked about extraction first, so people are starting to get an understanding that it doesn't work. But that's a dangerous and quite, you know, that's a despairing phraseology. You've got people who are just saying things don't work anymore. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with that, but until you start to suggest ways that it could be better, and we've seen it yesterday in New York, that people say this isn't as good as it gets, and we can start building something different. Now, that for me talked about the society, but it also needs to be the way our economy operates to fit underneath that. And I think sometimes, I remember this was a while ago, you know, like most people, I trained, my economics course was all about standard everyday economics. And it wasn't until about, I don't know, 15 years ago that someone said to me, you realize that economics is a social construct, don't you, Mark? And you start to go, we should start to ask ourselves the question, why aren't we constructing it in a way that actually works for people? What's wrong with us as political thinkers, leaders, people who are interested in this stuff, to not start challenging things to mean that it becomes better? And I think that can start quite an exciting conversation. I think it also, for me, will highlight the deficiencies in the devolved models that both Scotland and, you know, Scott, you've got more powers than we've got, and, you know, you can't make the differences you need to. And I think it starts to highlight those differences, that the issues that we can then start to say to people, right, this is really important. We need to change society like this. This model is not just stopping. It's not even, to my view, it's not just, you know, making it slower for us to achieve these things. It's actively stopping us from making lives better for the people in our countries, and that needs to change. I think there's a last thing that I'd add to it. I think that culturally as well, Wales has a distinct culture, primarily around the language, which is something that people start to see, that actually we can be different in the island that we're in, but also to make ourselves, you know, these underpin the societal challenges that we've got as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to be driven by my audience here, and I've got a couple of political questions for you, Mark. Okay, so I think this is probably the same question here, but I'll just put it in. I've got two questions here. So can you see that on screen? What formula or formulae are we missing that enable us our rights to self-determination? So just take that on board. And then pretty much the same question, I think. Does Wales require a Section 30 order from Westminster? So if you want independence, and I know Plaid Cymru have said they're not going to go for independence in the first term of an elected government, is that still the case?
It is still the case, yeah.
Yeah. So independence, when it comes, will arrive after the first term. But I'm sure you're getting this question, Mark. But how? How will independence arrive, considering the situation we've got with Scotland and Wales within the devolved settlement?
It's exactly the same. So we don't have, it's not up to us to take those decisions ourselves at the moment. It's up to Westminster, which, you know, says everything about this union of equals that we're supposedly in that clearly doesn't work. I think we've got something in our favour insofar as we've not at this point had a referendum. So Scotland has had one go at it. I think we should therefore be, you know, you could argue the case that precedent allows us to have a go at it. And I think the pace of change in Wales is incredible. You know, when I first realised my movement towards the independence movement, you know, we were in the 10% of people who supported independence. There was a poll out before that, the March in Barry, 41% of people in Wales now support independence. So the growth of the movement is incredible. 72% of 16 to 24-year-olds support independence in Wales. So, you know, this is coming, and we've got to start having the conversations that I know you have on this channel and others do, that start to define what that's going to look like when the time comes. And I think I was at an event today where people were starting to talk to existing Senedd members and potential future Senedd members at Plaid Cymru. And one of the things that I talked about there was that we're in a place of absolute chaos in lots of ways at the moment. So the UK is in a state of, fast decline, and for me it's terminal. But how fast it can go is, I don't think any of us would have foreseen what's happened so quickly. Apart from those people perhaps on the right, I think those on the right, they play for this chaos. From out of this chaos is an opportunity for them. Whereas I think those of us on the more progressive side of politics need to start realizing this is our opportunity and we need to put something more positive in that space.
Absolutely. So real similarities on the political front as well as the economic front. So another connection, another similarity I see between both nations is that on day one of independence, we're both in an absolute desperate need for significant public expenditure. In Scotland, and you can tell me if this is kind of where your priorities would be, especially in transportation, telecommunications, housing stock and infrastructure, and to support electrification. That's kind of where we're in desperate need on day one. What is your thoughts about the priorities, the economic priorities on day one of independence? Are you okay? Are you starting from a good position, or will you need decades of large public expenditure?
We'll need decades of large public expenditure, and we need to, this is the one thing about applied government in the Senedd coming up, is that we need to start those building blocks now while we're in government in the Senedd, because some of the levers are there, clearly not enough, but some of them will be there. So I think there's work you can do on that. But ultimately, we have got challenges that will only require, the state is the only thing that can solve some of these challenges, and to think otherwise is foolhardy. Well, it's not just foolhardy, it's actually a complete abandonment of society, which is what we've had for the last 40 years, is we've just said the markets can solve everything. We can see that they haven't solved everything, and yet those of us who may say the markets aren't the answer are ridiculed when we say it. And I think we need to be clearer in our understanding that actually this isn't the way it works. How we then go and make sure that this gets funded on a long-term basis requires a different understanding of money, and public money in that regard as well. So I think this is it's a need, but there's one thing that again, something that I reflect on often, is that when young people realize that for the past, forever, since fiat money was started, we've told people that the limiting factor is public cash when it isn't, and we've got these major issues ahead of us that we've not resolved. They're just going to go, they're going to, rightly call us all out as people who've let them down. Our generation has been let down by the generation before us. We can't be the generation that lets the next generation down. This is time for us to stand up, and that's hugely exciting, but it's also, you can't fail. Failure to do this, I think, would be catastrophic. The world can't take what we're delivering to it.
Another failed decade, yeah, another failed generation. But let me go back to the priorities. So where do you see these? If we just look at infrastructure, and I know there's huge investments we can look at in kind of social infrastructure around health and education, but let's just kind of look at infrastructure. When you look across Wales, what does the nation need to become a much more modern country?
Well, an easy thing to look at is housing. Our housing stock is some of the worst in Western Europe. Some of the most ill prepared for the weather conditions that are coming our way. That's it's a Marshall Plan redevelopment of our housing stock. We need to be able to house people, and we need more housing as well, and that's the same across every part of the UK as it is at the moment. So I think that would be a key consideration. I think energy, we've got natural energy resources. We need to be able to have the ability to be able to get that energy and then to be able to utilize it effectively. And I think a large part of that is not just about big infrastructure. Some of this is about micro infrastructure. How do you put grids in small places so that communities can be responsible for their energy requirements and manage their energy needs? And then I think you look at, I think you talked about transportation. I think public transportation is particularly important. We have major lines that basically go west to east because they follow the extractive routes. We don't have very much that, to get from the south of Wales to the north of Wales requires a trip into another country. Now that's, it's a great thing to be able to say to prove how ludicrous it is, but it's also really difficult when you've got family who you should be able to visit relatively easily, who aren't that far away, but they require a public transport journey that takes you via Shrewsbury and Birmingham New Street. It just doesn't make these things don't make sense. So I think there'd be the things that you'd start with. I think you then get into, we're surrounded on three sides by water. We've got the second highest tidal range in the world, just on our doorstep in Barry. These are resources that are very usable for creating the energy that we need. And, it then you start to then have answers to saying, well, we don't need to be the nuclear capital of the UK because these are the things that are being foisted on us, and I'm not sure they're what we need.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I know Fidel Kabud, who we've had on the show a couple of times, often says a very easy way to look at a country to see if it still has a colonial structure is to follow the transport routes and see if it's changed from the hundreds of years when there's been resource extraction. And if it has changed, then you can say that you've been partly decolonized. If you can't, and those routes are similar, then it's a strong argument for there still being a colonial infrastructure, if not quite a colony. But I would certainly say
weirdly, William, some of the old Roman roads show that it was the extraction was quite, it wasn't at the same scale as we had with the Anglo-Saxon extraction that came subsequently. They were going between communities. We've got old Roman roads that go through Wales that go through communities. We don't expect this thing that's just, what's the fastest way out of town? That was the way it is, and it was always, whether it's the Severn Bridge, the A55, get it out of here. That's the way that money and resources have gone, and our people,
I did want to pull this up actually, and because that's a wonderful little segue into a graph that I remember finding after Kieran and I were speaking about this. So this is a graph here which I'll pull up, and it shows you it's not great quality, right? But it shows you the populations of the four nations of Great Britain, the United Kingdom, from like the 1500s, and you'll see basically that we're pretty similar until, for us, the Act of Union. And you'll see, if you're going back to 1300, 1500, 1600, you can see that Wales, which is in green, has always been smaller, but you can see that there's hardly been any increase in the population, similar to Scotland, which has been pretty much the same tracks. Ireland grew really big and then got small after the potato famine, but you'll see England is now, it was 4 times bigger than Scotland before the Act of Union, and it's now 10 times bigger. So you'll see that it is the people extraction, which is really, really important as well. And when we're talking about resources, I think we do need to concentrate on that. And my final point, my call out for you, Marcus, can you please have more electrified escalators and maybe cable cars? Because every time I come to Wales, I spend most of my time walking up exceptionally steep hills, and I would love that little bit of transport to help me there.
So as someone who's delivering lots of leaflets at the moment, and we've got quite a few hills in Barry, I feel it's the only exercise I'm going to be getting. So no, we're not going to do that. Let's keep those hills. They're good for us.
Okay,
the interesting thing, just on that graph, just before we go, the other thing that graph talks to is the fact that indigenous populations aren't really a thing. These are, when we spend too much time worrying about immigration in some quarters, we're a country, as is everywhere, that's made up of lots of different peoples. And I think that's you don't have to go far back to see where these increases happened in society. So I think it's quite a salient point.
A very good point. Kieran?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the nuclear being foisted. Interestingly, I've just been listening to another podcast, different podcast from ours, and there was an advert for, yes, you should get involved in nuclear. It's the exciting way for you to change your career. And yeah, I was a bit horrified. Yeah, because there is the UK government seemed to be quite keen to foist nuclear on Scotland, nuclear energy on Scotland, and small nuclear reactors, which really, if someone decides to bomb them, you're really in big trouble. Our nuclear reactors that we've got currently, they're fairly well protected by large amounts of concrete. But small nuclear reactors, and then if you're talking about moving them around from place to place, you're really talking about moving a really big, massive bomb and the consequences of that. So, again, this is something that's going to be foisted on us, and we really don't want it. And the other interesting thing that's just happened as well, I caught up with my local government information unit emails. You probably get them as well. But Highland Council have rejected the pylons that were planned to go down from the Highlands. There's been something happened up in the Highlands that's unprecedented. It's about 55 community councils. These are normally quite quiet, conservative people who just want to volunteer in their community. They're not paid. They've all gotten together across the Highlands. They've had a big meeting, and now the Highland Council has backed what they're saying, that they're not prepared to give planning permission for this because it's such a deeply unpopular thing. Because, and I mean, the irony is, in Thatcher's time, of course, we were encouraged to own our own properties, become a property owner, and all the promise that came with that. But then the flip side is that, suddenly you'll have infrastructure foisted upon you, which is then going to reduce the value of your property and potentially stop you from maybe moving to somewhere else, that kind of thing. And the irony of it, it's incredible that the politics that comes from Westminster, to me, just gets crazier and crazier. There's no logic to what they're saying a lot of the time. It just seems to roll in these 5-year cycles where no one really knows what they're doing. There's not a real plan. And, I've just come back from Spain. I've just been to Santander, a little bit smaller than Aberdeen. Bilbao, just before that, a little bit bigger than Aberdeen. And again, the infrastructure is much better. You just think this is how it should be. And that's how I felt when I lived in the Netherlands. It's just, the infrastructure is not where it should be. And I'm horrified to hear you say that Aberfan happened just a month before I was born. And, I'm horrified to hear that you're saying there's the potential for that to happen again. Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
And the thing that the Labour Senedd governments have said is that they've had some money to remediate some of these, but they've got about 1/10 of the money they need. So these things, and I hope and pray, I don't think we're at the same position as we were in 1966, but we're in a situation where we do have these slag heaps move, and they've moved recently, and you've had pictures of slag being pushed through people's in front of people's front doors. So this is a very real thing and a very real worry. And I think all the other points, I completely agree with you, Kieran. This isn't something that's settled implied, by the way, the nuclear question, because it comes with jobs. And I think that also is the other thing, is that we become far too dependent on the promise of jobs. And it talks to the renewable argument as well at the moment. When the renewable companies said they're going to come and need to build the infrastructure to create the energy of the future, et cetera, they've often said, and there will be thousands of new jobs. And they said that for the last 10 years, and they aren't there yet, or at all, frankly. And so you've got lots of people who bought into that argument, particularly politicians, and they need to rethink that, because some of these things, we have to decarbonize our energy. There's no doubt about that, but we need to do it in a way that actually it's not just all extractive again, because people are seeing it. And I think the scary thing is that the political classes are ignoring people who are saying they're against this infrastructure on their doorstep. And it isn't because they're anti-renewable, not at all. They just feel like this is being done to them. And you can't keep doing that and not expect people to stand up. The problem is with some of this is that it's then becomes very easy for the right to agitate them in other ways, and they become, if you consider that. But one of the most, I think, abhorrent phrases that's used at the moment is calling people NIMBYs all the time. And it suggests that they're not engaged. They are engaged. They just don't agree with the prevailing forces at the moment. But they're engaged, and they need to be consulted, talked to properly. And for me, the question of ownership is central to that. I think you can start to have tougher conversations if the benefits don't just accrue to wealth and they accrue to local communities.
Matt, you're spot on there, because I think the conversation around jobs is smoke and mirrors and it's distraction. And what we're being promised is that there'll be jobs. And what we really need to be saying is, no, we want to own these assets. We don't just want some income from working for the people who own these assets. We want to own these assets. And I think this whole discussion around employment is a way of saying to people, you'll get your bit, but still it's us that decide who gets the benefits from those resources. I'll point you to a really good bit of work last week out from the STUC, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, who looked at how many jobs are created in different parts of the energy sector. And I think they said something like, for every £1 million invested, there's 14 jobs in oil and gas. For every £1 million that are invested in renewable, there's one job. I'll say I can't exactly remember the figures, but they were looking at the difference. And again, this talks to this promise. So we're being promised these jobs as a way of making sure we don't encroach and take the wealth. But even these jobs are not materializing when you look at it. So I'm gonna ask you for another similarity, and of course, being the podcast that we are, we're going to have to talk on monetary independence and modern monetary theory. But for me, both nations can be empowered by the insights from modern monetary theory to become independently sovereign governments, issue their own currency on day one of independence. Do you see this as being crucial for Wales, and do you see the similarities between Wales and Scotland being currency users of a foreign currency, which is sterling, and the opportunity for them to be currency issuers of their own sterling, of their own currency when they're independent?
For me, this is probably the key tenet of the way I see our independence challenge. I think we need to have our own currency. We need to have our own central bank, and we need to have monetary sovereignty. We also need to understand how money works, which is again goes to the central tenet of the work that's been done. And I think that too often politicians either can't be bothered to get into the nitty-gritty. And I don't think the nitty-gritty is that difficult, actually, because I think we've seen things in recent times, particularly over COVID, that they're a bit like Wizard of Oz. When you get that moment where they opened the curtains and it's not a wizard, it's just a man. It's that. I think we had insights at different times, and we've just chosen to ignore those insights. So I think we're in a situation. It is central. I don't think at the moment the independence movement is in Wales, but it is fully on board with that. Yeah. I think there's an argument by some, they critiqued a piece that you wrote in the Welsh press relatively recent, William, if you remember, and said that we needed, we should just take the sterling and we can keep things as they are.
It's all very 2014 for us. I think that was the thrust of my argument, was they seem to be having the arguments that we had in 2014. We did that job for you. It doesn't work. We've moved on to that.
Yeah, and I think entirely agree with you. I think the other thing that it comes down to is that too often people say, well, we can be independent and we can, because we can run the country as it's run now. Well, for the 35% of kids who grow into poverty, it isn't working now. There are clear metrics. The people who can't get housing, there's clear metrics to say that society isn't working in the way it should. So just even if you deliver what's currently being delivered, and instead of the butcher's apron on top of all your government buildings, you have more Welsh dragons, that isn't good enough. And it's also, frankly, not exciting enough to encourage those people who don't want to be part of this movement to be part of it. We need better.
Yeah, yeah, and what you're saying is that the currency is one of the most important vehicles to allow your economy to differentiate itself from a version of the economy as it is under the UK.
So I don't think it's I think it is the most important thing. I think this is critical. And I think we've got some time now where we can start to have these conversations. You know, we need to utilize our time, hopefully with Plaid Cymru leading the government in Wales, to start to think about these things more broadly and open it up such that we come to a point in the next term of government where we can start to seriously tell people and get people to engage in a debate over independence. And if we're starting from a base that's higher than Scotland was when Scotland had the referendum given to them, that I think gives us a stronger position to be able to argue for it in Wales. But it's, you know, these things are just, this is a building momentum time. It's having the right conversations. And it's also, I think, being prepared to engage with people who disagree with us in a, you know, collegiate way. I think that's one of the things that we need to make sure we do. We need to get into these debates about money, currency, and the public's the opportunity that gives us and the risk that gives us as well. You know, it changes things. We become suddenly fully responsible for everything. You know.
Yeah, yeah. And I've got Kieran back here. Yeah, absolutely. So another similarity, but I kind of wanted to touch on the differences, and I think this is an important distinction here, is that Scotland and Wales have a huge trading relationship or a commercial relationship with England. England is the primary destination and source for the majority of our trade. Now, that will continue after independence, and we have to be very conscious that for possibly three decades, 40 years, our main partner is still going to be the country, one of the countries that we've separated from the UK. But Wales is an even more of a close relationship with England commercially because of the size of your border and how much that border is for Wales. Could you talk a little bit about the differences you see in the ability to disconnect the economy of Wales and England that we might not see the same magnitude when we think about disconnecting the economy of Scotland and of England?
So again, this isn't being pedantic. I think that again, the language is a bit different. I think our economies will be connected, our societies will be connected, our families will be connected. So this won't be a breach insofar as you know, England and Wales won't be interacting. We have our border will remain porous. I don't think anybody in the independence movement wants to make the Offers Dyke, you know, build Offers Dyke up again and put guard posts on it. That isn't what we're talking about. We want to have a constructive adult relationship with the country next door. So I think there will be things that we need to be focusing our economy on, and a lot of this is internal. So making sure that we, you know, if it takes things like timber, that we grow the trees that can be put into the houses of the future. The energy infrastructure, we talked briefly about making sure that energy is something that can be distributed locally. I think that's really important as well. So we don't become less dependent on the relationship as we were before. And that relationship is something that's, you know, more reflective of our qualities that we've got as a country and the ones that England has next door. But I think I don't think you know, separation is a word that indicates that there's a final to it, and I don't think there is. I think we're forever going to be a country that I say this, it's stuck a little bit, but I do mean it. Our best mates will have to be the people who are next door to us. To be honest, and I'll say this, you'll always be our best mates in Scotland, but you know, we'll be England. We'll be close to them. There's the family, even things like family relationships are things that are critical. You're on mute, I think, William. I can't hear you.
My final question, I want to touch on your expertise in terms of financing and public banking, because independence if we have our own currency, and I don't want to labour the point, but it's really important that if you want Wales to have an independent financial services sector, then you have to have a Welsh central bank which issues a Welsh currency to be able to regulate a Welsh financial system, financial services system. If you don't have a currency and a central bank, you can't have a separate financial services system. It would be regulated by the Bank of England or by the FCA in London. So it's absolutely essential if we want our banks to operate differently, then we need to have our own currency and central bank. What's your views on financial services? Should this be something that Wales looks to do differently, maybe having banks focus much more on the public purpose rather than on profit?
So the thing I've been working on for quite a while is to try and set up a community, cooperatively owned community bank for Wales, and there's a real interest in it and being able to establish one of those. At the moment, that would be done under the auspices of the Bank of England and the regulators, the regulators there. But I think this talks to a couple of things. One is that regulation and institutions is central to what we do as we create our statehood. We need to make sure that we get that right. And for all of those institutions and regulators, from banking to food regulation or anything, I think there are things that you need to have a purpose that's not just about extraction and profitability, which is what at the moment we try and do as little as possible to not impede the market. And I think what we need to do is to set our regulator to make sure they do the most that they possibly can do to make sure that we grow the food we want, that we have banks that actually make sure banks work for rich people, but everyone needs banks. How's that? You know, it really is something that needs to be upended. And, you know, again, I don't think it's difficult to be able to get people with you on this, because essentially everything, you know, all of these things work for the wrong purpose at the moment, or purposes that are not suitable for most of the people in the country. So yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. But again, it talks to, we can do some of this regulating now. You know, at the moment we've got the Dura Cymru as our Wales Water, so our water provider. But they've got some of the worst performances in the UK. They've also got a new chief executive who's been criticised for being a union buster. You know, these things are just they're not congruent with a society that wants to see something a bit better. They may be able to hide behind we're a not-for-profit, but you know, you can't get away with that when you have bonuses that like they've been having. So it's
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to add that comment we've got here, which is, I think the biggest problem we have in this day and age is believing that we need permission from someone on making things better or preventing an encroaching collapse. And I think that, you know, I like to use the word proceed until apprehended. I think we need much more of that, certainly within the Scottish government. And I hope if Plaid Cymru does come to power next year, then they are a lot more progressive and demanding of Westminster than we have been in Scotland with the SNP. I've just asked the audience if there's any final questions, so I'll just wait and see. Kieran, have you got a final one before we let Mark go?
No, I think I've covered all the things that I wanted to ask him about. But I guess coming back to the problems with the old coal mines, of course, we've just seen a train come off the rails in Northern England recently as well. So, you know, the increase in rain, the increase in the intensity of rainfall will make solving that issue more urgent now.
Yeah, and I think it's something, you know, Plaid have been arguing for this for a long time. It's often considered a political issue. And how wrong is that? You know, this isn't a political, surely community safety isn't a political football. This is something that just needs solving. And we know, because we know a bit about the way money works in our current system, the only people who can solve the problem is the UK Treasury. You know, we don't have the resources. We're just a big local authority, essentially, in the Senate at the moment. You know, we don't have the resources we need to do all the things we need to do.
Right. Well, just a comment, Mark. could we just very, very briefly cut, because most of our viewers who are Scottish will be aware of the Barnett formula and our fiscal framework. And, you know, I didn't say to you I was going to cover this, but I just wondered if you could give us an indication of how the funding for the Welsh Assembly, the Welsh nation, differs, if it differs at all from what happens in Scotland, which I'll summarise as very much of England decides what it wants to spend on everything, and then Scotland gets a per person percentage for what it wants to spend on Scotland. So all of our decisions are made on behalf of Scotland in Westminster, and we just get proportional allocations. So rather than it being allocated by need, it's allocated purely on a per capita basis, which when you consider nations are completely different, doesn't really sound like the most efficient or effective way to do that. Is Wales and the Welsh settlement any different, Mark?
No, and the guy who set it up, Joel Barnett, said that this was a system that would never work and never see us through as well. So he knew it was completely wrong. We have some special things as well where we get things like HS2, which doesn't lay a single track anywhere near Wales, classified as an England and Wales project, so we don't get the benefit of that. There's a line that runs between Oxford and Cambridge that was recently classified as a England and Wales project. And last time I looked, neither of those two beautiful cities are anywhere near Wales. So we have a peculiar thing where, because a lot of these things can be, it's just officials in the Treasury making up the rules as they go along. They're subject to political interference, which is just a complete nonsense. You know, we've also, not dissimilar to Scotland, but we've got a iller and older population than the rest of the UK. So Surprise, we need more money spent on health services. But if you don't get that through the Barnett formula, you don't get the ability to, it's not a needs-based formula. The challenge we've got is that if it was allocated, if we looked at it again now, all of the nations and regions of the UK would have to agree to a change, and that isn't an easy thing to do. So I don't think that's coming anytime soon. There's the Welsh government have just announced today, I think, to say they've agreed a review of the Barnett formula for Wales with HM Treasury. But, you know, we know how politics works. Reviews are places to stick things you'd never want to do anything with or about, and they're just to placate an audience. The interesting thing is that those audiences have cottoned on, and they realise that these people are talking bollocks.
Well, we had a fiscal framework renegotiated just over 2 years ago, and Shona Robinson just this week said that it's a fiscal framework that's not fit for purpose. So, and there was a lot of messaging from the administration at the time that we'd done really well from this fiscal settlement, but I think the truth is showing that actually we're in a position where the fiscal settlement, which relied on Scotland to outperform the UK in terms of growth for us to increase our income, and it's also affected by the income tax ranges in England. And there's some work that the Fraser Islander Institute have done that says that if England does reduce, does change the income tax, does put up the lower band of income tax in England, then the Scottish budget will be around about £1 billion worse off. So there's clearly these connections that we've got to look at. But my two takeaways for you, Marcus, I think you said that first of all.
Can I just jump in a second? You've got a Welsh viewer who's just messaged me, right, and he said the thing that I need, and I'd forgotten about this, but he said, remind William, unlike Scotland, we didn't choose to join the union. Should have more rights to force our way out. So I think that's just as a salutary, whether you chose it or not is we can argue the toss on that one, I suppose. But still,
well done for saying that. You definitely had to say that. So the takeaways I want to take, you've said very clearly that the economic system that we have overall is socially constructed, and it's designed by the people who are in positions of power. And there's no such thing as these kind of economic rules or these economic laws that we think have to dictate our economy. And then secondly, you've said that actually even within the institutional framework that we have at the moment, that things like the Barnett formula and where we are in terms of the United Kingdom fiscal framework is because people have designed it and it can change. And this is a big challenge that you would throw out to the UK government, because you would say, if you want to keep Wales and Scotland in this union, then you have to start operating in a way that treats them as an equal nation, socially, culturally, and economically. Because if you don't, then the argument for keeping that union together becomes even weaker than it is right now. You know, and I would just say there's no evidence that the institutions of the United Kingdom have any interest in treating Scotland or Wales any differently from what they've done for decades and for centuries.
But so the good news is the train's left the station. They can't claw this thing back anymore. I think we're in a position now. You know, you look at what's happening in Ireland, and you know, how long is it going to take before the north of the country and the south of the country reunites? I think Wales. And you may feel free to disagree. I think Wales perhaps will maybe in a position to be able to leave the union before Scotland, the way things are going at the moment. And I think that's our job, to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that the SNP made when they got first into power. I think there's some things we need to get to think about really carefully over the next time period, and you know, and to try and create some hope. You know, we started this conversation talking about people who are saying, well, they've seen us showing the door in Caerphilly gives hope. Well, let's build on that and start talking about things that actually give hope back to people, because it's sorely missing in the body politic these days.
Absolutely. Mark, well, a lovely way to almost finish, because I've been contacted from a Scottish viewer, and he says to me, remind Mark that only 0.02% of the Scottish population voted for the Union in 1707. And there was riots in many of our cities at that point. So
it wasn't a dig at the Scottish. I wasn't that. This was, if I hadn't have said it, I'd have been in deep trouble. And
if I hadn't responded, likewise. Mark, it was great. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, and hopefully I'll see you soon.
Yeah, take care.
Thanks. Bye now. Well, that was a nice little treat for us to have a live episode with Mark.
Yeah, and interesting to learn a little bit more about the makeup of Plaid in the councils and in the Senate. Very interesting for me. I'd like to know more. I need to make a trip down to Wales soon, I feel.
Yes, definitely. You get all your exercise down there for sure. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm just going to give you a little advert before we disappear. And we've no live shows on the horizon for the next few weeks, but I'm sure it won't be too long until we're back with you. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. And Kieran, bye, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now. If you're enjoying this episode of the Scotonomics podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/Scotonomics. Also, please do like, share, and comment on this podcast.